Hi guys, my name is Uhuru Mofokeng and welcome to the South African Book Review Sessions, your online political book club, where everything political literature is dissected, vivisected, and eviscerated. We are still very grateful for the feedback we're receiving. We are quite overwhelmed. Please click on the subscribe button if you have not subscribed. To subscribe comes at no extra cost. So what are we doing today? All I can tell you is the book we're doing today is an antithesis to the narrative that says black government or the government of the African National Congress in South Africa is solely responsible for the idea or the policy of cadre deployment. It challenges it challenges that narrative. It challenges the narrative that the ANC or the black government is solely responsible for the chronism we see within the state and the rewarding of government contracts to members of the ruling political elite or the ruling political organization. Now, the book is titled Super Afrikaaners. It was written by Ivor, Wilkinson, and Hans Strydom. Super Afrikaaners inside the Broederbond. Now, this book was first released in 1978. It was a absolute bestseller. It sold so much. It's a South African classic. It was re-released in 2012. This is the 2012 edition. Quite a good read. And yes, we are going to give a rating to the book at the end of the video. As I've said, this book is an antithesis to the narrative that a black government or the government of the African National Congress is solely responsible for the policy of cadre deployment. This book proves that cadre deployment has been in existence way before even the ANC turned into the liberation movement that it eventually became. While the ANC was still a gentleman's club where it was sending deputations and writing letters were the orders of challenging the racist and unjustified and unconstitutional laws which basically were the order of the day during the apartheid government times. Now, guys, this book is a serious indictment to the Afrikaners who make noise about cadre deployment, because this book tells you about scary cadre deployment. Like this, it's a proper depiction of cadre deployment. The Afrikaaner Broederbond they talk about in this book is an embodiment of cadre deployment. It is actually cadre deployment is a legacy of the Afrikaaner Broederbond's interest as implemented by the National Party government. According to this book, the Afrikaaner Broederbond was founded in 1918 by a small clique of Afrikaners, amongst whom were members of the clergy, members of the security services or security forces, politicians, and all the intelligentsia, and all members of the elite Afrikaners of those days. They met and started an organization which was to operate in secrecy for the next 80 years. The organization's aim initially was to advance the socio-economic and political interest of the Afrikaner people. It did so successfully up until it was power drunk. It then managed to transform itself into a deployment committee of the Afrikaner people. It was a very exclusive structure. In order for you to join it, you had to be, according to them, of pure Afrikaner blood. I still don't know what that means. You have to be of pure Afrikaner blood from the Calvinist domination, Christian domination. That means maybe one of those Dutch Reformed churches, and all of these other complicated leanings which actually bordered on a right-wing Afrikaner fanatism. Now, this book tells you on how the Afrikaaner Broederbond managed to deploy its members to the cabinet, to primarily all prime ministers, according to this book, were members and leaders of the Afrikaner Broederbond. All prime ministers of apartheid from 1948 till 1990. That means from D.F. Malan up until F.W. de Klerk, all of the members of the Afrikaner Broederbond, all of them, D.F. Malan, Hendrik Verwoerd, Forster, Porter, all of them, they were members of not just the National Party, but members of the Afrikaner Broederbond. It also tells us that only a handful of MPs and cabinet members of the National Party were not members of the Afrikaner Broederbond, like only a handful, and the rest were all members and leaders of the Afrikaner Broederbond. So the Afrikaner Broederbond managed to deploy the prime minister of the country from 1948 to 1990. They managed to deploy ministers, they managed to deploy MPs, they managed to deploy all sorts of bureaucrats within the state apparatus. They deployed within the state parastatals their own people, the chairpersons of the SABC from 1948 till 1990 were members of the Afrikaner Broederbond. They were mentioned in the list of the Broeder. Most of them were mentioned in the list of the Afrikaner Broederbond, which came with the initial release in 1978. Now, so this book talks of how the Afrikaners were in charge of every sector of society, not just the state, but even in the church. The Calvinist churches, all of them, all forms of the Dutch Reformed churches, all of its variations were led from head to toe by brooders. The directions those institutions were taking was determined by the Broederbond. Academic institutions, your universities, were led by brooders, thus determining the direction they were going to take. So the Broederbond eventually had its stranglehold on all South African society in such a way that even some black institutions were originally ideas and were implemented by the Afrikaner Broederbond. For example, Radio Bantu, which today we know as Ukhozi FM, was originally an Afrikaner Broederbond idea to promulgate apartheid propaganda amongst the majority of the Zulu-speaking South Africans. Now, this book is a story of how an organization managed to use its own influence to catapult people from a position of poverty to being the ruling class. In terms of how they started banks, how they started insurance companies, how they started some institutions, like your South African Institute of Race Relations was started by the Afrikaner Broederbond, for example. It tells you of how it managed to advance its ideas through various sectors of society who were key members from its own ranks were deployed. And key amongst the deployment factors in the Afrikaner Broederbond was capacity. These guys valued capacity so much. They deployed the best amongst themselves. Their interest was not just to benefit themselves personally, because obviously you're in Afrikaner Broederbond, you are going to get a good position, so you are going to benefit from that position. They did not care. But then you being in that position, you must benefit ultimately the larger Afrikaner population, and that is key. Personally, that is one thing I like. It created efficiency. They were clear on advancing a cause of a particular people, and they did so at whatever cost. Yes, they did that at the cost of Africans, and that hurts me. And that has always put us a couple of yards behind the Afrikaner as far as academia, as far as socio-economic issues are related. But however, this is a story of how the Broederbond entrenched cadre deployment within the systems of the state of the country. Now, that proves in itself that when the ANC inherited the state in 1994, it inherited also the policy of cadre deployment, which had been in practice from 1948. Yes, it kept strategic members of the apartheid regime from in the government of national unity. But as soon as 99 and going forward, the ANC started deploying its own comrades within within strategic sectors of society. And that is not solely an ANC thing. The ANC took that thing from the National Party and the Afrikaaner Broederbond. So it can be an exclusively a black government thing. No, they're deploying themselves, they're deploying comrades, cadre deployments, they're giving each other tenders. The Afrikaners were doing that. They actually started it. I think the ANC government and ANC deployees have learned this from the Afrikaners who are in charge through the National Party. So that means one of the legacies of the Afrikaaner Broederbond is a state which was under siege because of cadre deployment. There was no other means of tried and tested means of deploying people within the state besides cadre deployment, deploying comrades of your own organization to actually advance your own manifesto that you were elected by the electorate to advance. So that did not come with the ANC. It came with Afrikaners. It's an Afrikaner thing. So we should not hear an Afrikaner make noise about cadre deployment. No, it should not. No Afrikaners should make noise about that. Their forefathers came with that idea. They implemented it to the core. And when you see the black government doing that, it is actually a reflection of what was started by the Afrikaners through the Afrikaaner Broederbond and the National Party. Now, maybe the difference then is the prioritization of capacity. I think the ANC needs to prioritize capacity besides loyalty and any other thing. The capacity of the comrades, the qualifications of that particular individual. We need to deploy the best amongst us. That's what these Boers did, and it worked for them. So we should try that, and I'm sure it's going to work for us. And we should always seek not to advance those who are self-serving and inward-looking. We need to advance a particular cadre who is mass-orientated, who's vision-orientated, who is driven by the passionate love and the drive of advancing to the national democratic society, the blacks in general and the Africans in particular. We need that particular and the best amongst us. Then I believe whatever we are trying to do with the state can be done. And then cadre deployment will not be seen in the particular light that it's been. Because comrades, at this particular stage, it is justified for people to say cadre deployment doesn't work. But cadre deployment does work, and it needs to be properly managed. The Boers showed us that it worked. The Boers were very efficient in their brutality, in their repression, in their hatred, in their systematic racism. They were very efficient in building a very exclusive and racial economy that served them and that advanced them. So that efficiency, we need to use that, have that same efficiency to advance our people to the National Democratic Society. So this book actually vindicates the African National Congress that it is not the pioneer of cadre deployment. They find cadre deployment there, but then it is an indictment that it needs to do cadre deployment in a strategic and in a particular manner that seeks to advance people. Now, this is a good book. It talks about how the Broederbond eventually got exposed, how they fell, how they were lost their influence, how the Broederbond had a number of factions, and how they had breakaways, how we see the breakaway of the HNP led by Albert Herzog. We later see the breakaway of the Conservative Party in the early 80s. It's an interesting book. It's an intriguing book. From 0 to 10, how would I rate it? I would rate it a 7. I would rate it a good 7. It's a good book. It's a story of influence and power, how the state turned out to be, why we see some of these things, the rewarding of tenders through cronyism, how we see cadre deployment and how it's entrenched within the state by these particular individuals. It tells you of how influential they were to society in such a way. It tells of a particular story of the SABC. How television, after it was introduced in the world, it took like for a very long time for it to come to South Africa, because the Afrikaaner Broederbond were still devising a mean of not allowing American influence and British and Western influence to come into the South African television and subsequently influence the natives, the blacks, and meaning the ideas of freedom, of seeing other blacks having such independence, of having independence and having societies quite different from the then South Africa. So this guys managed the arrival of South Africa in a very strategic way, making sure that whatever comes into television will be pro-apartheid agenda that seeks to undermine and further repress and further oppress the blacks. There was no particular program in television. Television was not aimed in South Africa initially. It was not aimed to empower a black person. That's why a black person should not find refuge in the television in South Africa. In its DNA, there is no assistance a black man is going to receive in a television, because it's not aimed at elevating you and making you better. It's aimed at distracting you, at feeding you a particular narrative about yourself and positioning and to try keep you in a position as a hewer of wood and a drawer of water. This book tells an interesting tale of how the Afrikaner, at the expense of blacks and other races, catapulted themselves to a ruling class, how they deployed themselves in order for them to have absolute control of the state. It is an interesting tale. It is a background of cadre deployment. It tells of chronisms. It tells you how Afrikaner business was favored. It tells you how Afrikaner banks were favored over other banks. It tells you how Afrikaner insurances were favored over other banks. It tells you of proper right-wing Afrikaner nationalism. Some of these nationalistic elements, they are telling him we ought to adopt as the African National Congress government or black government as such, in order for us to actually conquer the battle against unemployment, inequality, and poverty, and to alleviate the black person from the bottom of the food chain, and to make the black class a proper ruling class in its entirety, like what the Afrikaaner Broederbond did with the Afrikaner in its days. It's a great book. I recommend it. It's a 7. It's a book that everyone should read. It will give you an understanding. Once you read this book, you can come talk to me about cadre deployment. Until then, you still need to be schooled.